Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming to my presentation here. My name is Mike Slaw. I am a principal industry specialist with a focus in consumer identity and authentication. I wanted to speak to you a little bit today about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, and that is customer authentication and how you bring strong forms of authentication like multi-factor authentication to a large consumer base on there. So if you're attending or watching this session, I'm assuming you're a key decision maker or leader within a consumer identity world. So let me set up a scenario for you. You've got a user base, and this user base could potentially be millions of people out there. You've done a risk assessment, and you've determined that your users need some level of strong authentication brought to them. You want to go with multi-factor authentication. But as you look at your user base, you realize that your customers have varying levels. They run the whole scale in terms of security needs. You've got users who are very highly technical, very security conscious, have adopted security features, and then you've got users that don't know anything about how they can protect themselves or how they can partner with you to protect themselves and their financial and personal information. You've got consumers with varying levels of authentication capabilities, from very capable consumers who can pass any form of authentication you put in front of them, to users who struggle with even the basic forms of authentication. And lastly, you've got consumers who will accept a little bit more steps, accept a little bit more friction within the process. And then you've got consumers who absolutely demand the best user experience as part of this. So these are characteristics that are typically applied to any large group of consumers. And bringing security to them, what I will say is authentication exists for one purpose, and that purpose is a security purpose. If you were to remove the security risk, you wouldn't need authentication. You would simply be able to identify them and move forward. So authentication is a security function, and as such, security is the primary focus. Now, that being said, it's followed very closely by an excellent user experience, because user experience is how we get people to adopt security practices in there. So ideally, you're looking for an authentication experience that provides a large amount of security and provides it in a way that makes it easy and seamless for the users to use. So how do you go about bringing out this strong security to this large group of consumers? Well, there's a couple of different building blocks that we're going to talk about in this session today. The first is default on security. What does that mean? That basically means you turn on your highest and strongest forms of authentication by default, so that new users, new customers to your organization, they get the strongest security up front, and they don't know any other way to authenticate with you other than using strong forms of authentication. Now, that may seem a little counterintuitive, but I will tell you that when you default security on, users are much more likely to continue with that security than if you drive them to adopt it themselves. I think any security professional will tell you that consumers generally don't adopt security features as they interact with your authentication environment. So by turning them on by default, you still give certain consumers the ability to turn them off if they don't work for them. But what I will tell you is you will have the vast majority of your users, your consumers, continue to stay with those strong forms of authentication. So default on for new consumers, new customers, is a must in order to do that. You have to start from a point forward to get strong security out to your customers. The second option is authenticator of choice. And we're going to dive a little bit deep into this and talk about what exactly that means. So authenticator of choice means providing authentication options to your users. So there is not a single authentication method that will work for everybody in any circumstance. If there was, then we as an industry would have found it, and we would all be using it, and I wouldn't be here talking to you today because we would have solved this problem. So with that vast array of users within your environment, you have to give them choices, because what works for me as a consumer isn't going to work for somebody else. And what works for them may not work for somebody else within the same environment. So the idea of authenticator of choice is a couple things. First, you have to build an infrastructure that allows for multiple authenticators to be presented to the user. We call this basically an authentication plan, where this authentication plan can be customized to your user as they come in. So me, as a very security conscious consumer, I will want to choose and enroll authenticators that work for me. High security, I want to turn off low security ones and use that for me. But even with me, if I have one way to authenticate, that may not work for me every single time I try to authenticate. I need to have choice within my authenticators. So authenticator of choice leads to multi-factor authentication. So I know I'm talking to a group of security professionals here, but I'm going to kind of go back and go very basic so we all understand what I'm referring to when we talk about multi-factor authentication. It basically consists of three parts. First is an identity claim. So this is who am I speaking to? And I can do that in a digital world through any number of means, through a username, an email address, a phone number. I can ask you who you are. So that identity claim starts it up front. Now, the identity claim is not supposed to be secret. It's supposed to just simply identify the person. Now, when it comes to authentication, that's involving different authenticators. Now, in the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to call the first authenticator A1 and the second authenticator A2. So A1 and A2, in order to be truly multi-factor, they have to come from different factor groups. And those factor groups are something you know, like a PIN or a password, something you have, like a security key, a smart card, a one-time code, or something you are, like some form of biometrics. Now, in order to have true multi-factor authentication, you have to select two authenticators from different factors. I've seen authentication mechanisms that claim to be multi-factor, but they're using a password followed by a PIN, which is better than simply a password alone, but it's not considered multi-factor. At best, it's considered multiple single-factor authentication. And I've also seen authentication ecosystems proclaiming to be MFA when they just use one factor. So think of something like biometrics. I'm going to do a touch and I'm in. That's multi-factor authentication. Well, technically it's single-factor authentication because you're only using a single authenticator to allow access. Now, there are ways that you can combine these authenticators to get true multi-factor authentication. And that's really what authenticator of choice is all about. You get the first authenticator presented from a list of all of the available authenticators to them. They select the authenticators that work for them. And then for their second authenticator, you're going to present all of the other options minus the authentication factors that came from the first group that was chosen. Once you do this, you truly get a multi-factor authentication. That makes it much more difficult for cyber criminals and fraudsters to defeat because they now have to achieve two authenticators instead of simply just one. So there's a number of different authenticators that can be used here. And I've always said that as an authentication leader, my job is to just simply go out and find new and cool ways to authenticate and then give them to my users, my customers, as options for how they can access their financial or personal information. So once I have this array of authentication methods out there, how do I go about ranking, racking, and stacking them? Because everybody, at least watching this session, knows that something like a biometric is it has much more strength than a password or a PIN. So how do I figure out which authenticators are acceptable. Now, what you do here is you look out and you span the array of all of the authentication methods that you have. And then using some objective form, and there's a whole different set of ways that you can go about doing this. It's probably a whole nother topic for another time. But you rank the security of each of these authenticators. So biometrics will score high. Passwords may score low. One-time code sent via text or email will score. And it's all based on your risk tolerance as an organization, which is going to include how high risk are your customers, how high risk are your transactions that you're trying to prevent. All of this stuff feeds into a risk model in there. Now, I will call out, there is a trap that you can fall into when doing this, is that you can get so fine-grained in determining the risk of authenticators that it creates a very unusable environment for you as an administrator of authentication. Let me give you an example. Let's say you come up with a very slick 100-point system of authentication, where a biometric, that is 100 points of authentication, and a one-time code sent via SMS is 60 points of authentication, and a password is 30 points of authentication. And you thinking, oh, well, I'm going to just basically add up the points, and if you have enough authentication to do a certain transaction, then great, I'm going to let you through. And on paper and in theory, that sounds great. That really allows you to get very fine-grained in this. In practice, what happens is, because you've assigned numerical values to something that is not numerical, you tend to want to do math on that. So is a 60-point authenticator exactly twice as strong as a 30-point authenticator? You really don't know, and it's very hard to gauge that scale. And so as you start seeing certain cyber attacks come in, you may want to have the temptation to take that 30-point authenticator and make it 33 points. But really, that has a hard time cascading itself through the system in any meaningful way. And what it does is it builds a lot of complexity going into that. I'm not saying it's impossible to work, but I'm just saying it is very complex in order to do that and do it right and do it effectively. So what I propose is something a bit different, a bit simplified. So you've got each of your authenticators out there, and you've got them scaled on a certain level. You set a bar. You set a high trust bar to say, any authenticator that is above this level, I'm going to trust, and I'm going to trust them all the same. Even though there is some variation in their actual security, I'm not going to worry myself with that. I'm just going to say, these are all highly trusted. Okay, what that means, we'll get into in a minute. Okay, if you want to get a little bit more fine-grained, you can set a second bar and say, this is my medium trust authentication. So anything above the high bar, that's highly trusted. Anything above the second bar, but not quite to the high bar, that's moderately trusted. Anything below the bars, we're just not even gonna use that. So then this becomes a question as you start dealing with cybercrime. It becomes a question of, do I still trust this authenticator like I did before? If you start seeing a particular authenticator get compromised on a regular basis, you ask yourself the question, do I still trust this? And if all of a sudden, because of your scale that you've built, if you no longer trust that, that's when it becomes time to retire that authenticator and move to something better. You can also look at this when you're adding new authenticators. Like, I can add new authenticators to replace those that I'm retiring, and I can see exactly where they fall inside of my trust thresholds that I've set up. So the decision becomes a lot easier at that point, because you're looking at risk, you're looking at trust, and rather than saying, is it 29 points or 30 points, something that's very fine-grained, you can just look at it and say, well, I no longer trust this authenticator, so therefore it must be set on a path to deprecation. Or I've added this new authenticator. It achieves a high trust level. It's going to be used quite significantly. That might give us the risk tolerance and to remove other authenticators from that ecosystem. So once you've established these trust thresholds, you can then put them in a very simple matrix. Looking at A1 and A2, you're looking at high and moderate trust authentication methods. So if you are using if somebody is logging in and they happen to pick a high trust authenticator for A1, then their A2 can be anything high or medium. You're basically going to say, I'm going to let you choose any of the remaining ones. However, if your A1 is a moderate trusted, at the moderate level, then your A2 only can be high trusted authenticators in order to maintain some level of strength within your entire multi-factor authentication equation. If somebody wants to use 2 moderately trusted authenticators, you can then come in there and say, nope, that is not a combination that is allowed in order to authenticate and get access to personal or financial information. Now, I understand, I've been working in this environment for long enough to know that risk is a lot of times based on the transaction or the intent of the particular user as they're interacting with your services. Okay, so this model can be applied in several different ways. What you're seeing here on the screen is this model applied to authentication that happens all the way up front. There's a legitimate school of thought that says, why do I want to interrupt users in their interaction by throwing more authentication or step up authentication challenges at them? Why do I not want to do a full authentication up front and then turn them over to the business to transact with them in any way that they choose? That is one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is, well, if they want to do a high risk transaction, then I want to do a certain level of authentication. But for lower risk transactions, maybe I'll be a little bit more acceptable to that. So in this model, you can look at it and say, for the most high risk transactions out there, I'm going to need 2 high trusted authentication methods, authenticators. For something that's sensitive but doesn't cross that high risk threshold, I can then accept a high and a medium. I can balance that out. And for the lowest risk transactions that are out there, I might be okay and I might be acceptable of 2 moderately trusted authentication methods. So this is a very easy way to look at and understand how to apply multiple authenticators into your environment. Now, this can be customized and it's flexible for a variety of different environments going through there. So when you're looking at applying this authenticator of choice, there's really 3 things that you need to look at. 1 is give the users choice. 2, let them opt in or opt out. And 3, apply those authenticators in a way that makes sense based on your risk tolerance and your the risk of your transactions. So the third building block that we're going to talk about in terms of getting MFA out to a large consumer audience is cohort segmentation. So now that you've got this authenticator of choice infrastructure in place, how do you go about rolling it out and adopting it? I said earlier, and I'll reiterate it right now, that consumers don't generally adopt strong forms of authentication on their own. They either have to be defaulted into it or enrolled in it through some program for that. So to do that, to enroll users into strong authentication, you'll want to go out and look at your user base. And I guarantee you in your user base, there is some subpopulation that's not insignificant of users who would be ready and willing to adopt stronger security. They just haven't yet because it hasn't been top of mind for them. Find those users, get with your analytics team, find those users and put them into a cohort of easy adopters. That's where you're going to start. You're going to communicate to them. You're going to let them know how their experience is going to change, what it's going to look like, what are their expectations, and what are you signing up for in that whole protection model. Once you've communicated out to them, it's simply just moving them over to stronger forms of authentication. Once again, based on your risk tolerance, you can let them downgrade, but if you do this right, you will have very few users actually downgrading for that. So then you go out and look at, okay, well then who are the people who are almost ready? Maybe they're missing the capability of a new authenticator. Maybe they're missing some profile information that I can use for authentication. So you grab on, you collect those people and you put them into another bucket, another cohort bucket. And then you can go out and look at other groups. And we won't get into all of these, but you basically look at your groups of your customer base, and you segment them out into groups based on their likelihood, their needs, their ability to adopt the strongest form of authentication. And then what happens is that you build your roadmap around providing what is necessary to move the next cohort group over into your authentication environments. So you then start to focus and say, all right, for this next period, we're going to focus on our third cohort of people, moving them into multi-factor authentication. What do they need? Oh, they need capability X, Y, and Z. They need this and that. So you can program out your program. You can plan for delivering those capabilities so that when they're delivered, these group of people now become easy adopters, and they can be effectively communicated to and moved over into multi-factor authentication, or a stronger form of authentication. This is a strategy that works because it allows you to focus on the things that your customers need. And when you start looking at this, you can start growing your customer base more and more and more. Now, is 100% adoption realistic? It would be very difficult to get to 100%. Start thinking and looking at maybe 90 to 95% adoption is absolutely possible and feasible. When you're looking through this, it takes time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes innovation and looking at your particular challenges that you face and coming up with creative ways of solving those challenges to move them into this form of authentication. So once you've hit critical mass with strong authentication across your user base, are you done? Unfortunately, you're not. There's going to still be things that you're going to have to be concerned with going forward on that. There are ways for cyber criminals to bypass multi-factor authentication and to get around that. Now, what I will say, and I don't want to minimize the effort of getting your users to a high percentage of multi-factor authentication, because that works, and you will see a dramatic decrease in your account takeovers. So what you will see is just everything else. You'll see social engineering attacks where fraudsters will interact directly with your customers to socially engineer the particular authenticators from them in order to authenticate into your environment. That is very difficult to prevent. It involves a lot of awareness, a lot of communication to your customers, and it involves a very strong partnership in security between you and your customers. You'll also see forms of scams and first-party fraud, where cyber criminals and fraudsters will interact directly with your customers, and either through duping them or them being complicit, you will see them working their methods of fraud against your institution. And then you will also see, as we talked about, lower trust thresholds, lower trust authenticators. You will see cyber criminals attacking the weakest link in your chain. And if that's an authenticator that you've put out there because you had to, you'll see attacks against that. And the key to that is tracking looking at how that authentication method has been abused in the past, and then making that trust decision that we looked at and we talked about earlier about whether or not you're going to trust that authenticator any longer. Can you replace that with another authentication method that is better, that is complementary to the capabilities that you've got with that? So thank you for watching this session. I appreciate you spending this time with me and watching till the end. If you have any comments or questions, my name is Mike Slaw. I will be at the Authenticate conference in October. You can find me there, or you can hit me up on any of my social media channels. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time.